All right, so get ready because we're diving deep into the 2014 Maidan Massacre in Ukraine.
Yeah.
You shared some fascinating research with me, and
Yeah.
the centerpiece is this thought-provoking article from Canadian Dimension.
All right.
Let's unpack this together.
Absolutely. It's a complex event.
Yeah.
With repercussions that are felt to this day.
Oh, yeah?
And this article presents a perspective that challenges what you might call the conventional narrative.
I think to set the stage for our listener,
Yeah.
we're talking about Ukraine in 2014.
Right.
Euromaidan protests are in full swing. Tensions are running high.
Yeah.
And the Maidan Massacre becomes this pivotal point
Absolutely.
that shapes everything that follows,
Yeah.
especially Ukraine's relationship with Russia.
And what makes this article so compelling is that it really delves into a recent Ukrainian court verdict.
Right.
That throws a major wrench into the widely accepted understanding of who was responsible for the massacre.
Yeah, that's what grabbed my attention.
Yeah.
It's not some fringe theory.
No.
That's not an external report.
Right.
This verdict comes from within Ukraine's own legal system.
Exactly. And the court's findings are pretty startling.
Yeah.
They concluded that at least 10 protesters who were killed
Wow.
and 115 who were wounded
Okay.
were actually shot from areas controlled by Maidan protesters.
Hold on. So are you saying that there's a possibility
It seems that way.
that protesters were firing on themselves?
Potentially, yeah.
That completely flips the script.
Yeah.
What kind of evidence did the court use?
Well, they meticulously analyzed eyewitness accounts.
Okay.
They looked at bullet trajectories and even referenced a BBC video showing Maidan activists in the Hotel Ukraina with firearms.
Can you break down bullet trajectory analysis for me?
Sure.
I've heard that term thrown around. I'm not exactly sure what it entails.
So it's basically like a forensic puzzle
Okay.
where experts analyze the paths of bullets
Right.
to determine where the shots originated. They look at things like bullet entry and exit points, the angle of impact,
Wow.
and even the type of firearm used.
Wow.
By piecing together these clues, they can create a sort of map of the shooting scene.
So in this case, the bullet trajectory analysis pointed to locations controlled by the protesters.
That's right. And it directly contradicts that image that we all have
Right.
of government snipers perched in these buildings targeting protesters.
This Hotel Ukraina keeps popping up.
Right.
What's the significance of that location?
The court specifically points to the Hotel Ukraina,
Right.
which was under the control of Maidan protesters at the time, as a key location from which shots were fired.
It's mind-blowing to think that the very people protesting against the government might have been caught in friendly fire.
It's a strange thought, isn't it?
Yeah. What was the court's reasoning behind this claim?
They cite a convergence of evidence.
Okay.
In addition to the bullet trajectory analysis. They reference eyewitness accounts that place armed individuals within the hotel.
Oh.
And they even highlight that BBC video we talked about that shows Maidan activists inside the hotel with firearms.
Wow, that BBC video sounds like pretty damning evidence.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is there any explanation for why protesters would have been armed inside the hotel?
That's one of the key questions this article raises.
Yeah.
And it delves into the alleged involvement of far-right groups in the Maidan protests.
Okay.
Specifically mentioning the Svoboda Party and the right sector.
To be honest, I'm not super familiar with those groups.
Okay.
Can you give me a little background on them?
Sure. So the Svoboda Party, also known as the All-Ukrainian Union, Svoboda,
Okay.
has roots in Ukrainian nationalism
Okay.
and has been associated with far-right ideologies.
Okay.
The right sector is a more loosely organized group,
Right.
but it also embraces nationalist and right-wing views.
Got it.
Both groups were active participants in the Euromaidan protests.
So how are these groups tied to the Hotel Ukraina and the potential for protesters firing on other protesters?
According to the court's findings, the Svoboda Party had asserted control over the Hotel Ukraina during the protests.
Okay.
They were essentially using it as a base of operations.
Okay. So if they were in control of the hotel,
Right.
and there's evidence of gunfire coming from that location, it's not a stretch to connect them to the shootings.
It would seem that way.
But what about the right sector? Where do they fit into this?
The court's findings also mention that the right sector's headquarters was located in the Central Post Office,
Okay.
another building from which shots were allegedly fired.
Okay.
And this time, the targets were German journalists.
That's a chilling detail.
It is.
So we've got the Svoboda party potentially linked to gunfire coming from the Hotel Ukraina.
Right.
And the right sector possibly involved in shooting at journalists.
Right.
It seems like the involvement of these far-right groups is more than just a side note.
Yeah.
It's potentially a key piece of this whole puzzle.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And this is where the article really starts to challenge that conventional narrative of the Maidan massacre.
If the court is pointing towards these groups as potentially responsible for some of the deaths,
right,
what does that say about the initial blame placed on the Berkut,
the
Ukrainian special police force?
That's a crucial question.
Yeah.
And the article argues that the evidence initially used to convict members of the Berkut was potentially fabricated.
Wait, hold on.
Yeah.
Are you saying that the evidence used to pin the blame on the Berkut was flawed?
Potentially.
That's a huge claim. What does the article base this on?
It highlights the fact that forensic analysis conducted years after the events actually contradicted the earlier findings.
So the initial investigations got it wrong?
It would seem so, yeah.
That's a pretty serious error.
It is. And the article goes even further, suggesting that the later forensic analysis, which pointed to the involvement of protesters, might have been deliberately manipulated to shift the blame away from the Berkut and onto the protesters.
That raises so many questions.
Yeah.
Who would benefit from manipulating the evidence in that way?
Wow.
And why go to such a lengths to protect the Berkut?
Well, this is where things get really intriguing.
Okay.
The article suggests that those who gained power after the overthrow of President Viktor Yanukovych, particularly those with ties to the far-right groups we discussed earlier, had a vested interest in painting the Berkut as the villains and themselves as the heroes.
So it's possible that the narrative of a government-led massacre
That's possible,
with the Berkut carrying out the orders served a specific purpose for those who came to power after the protests.
That's the implication.
It's starting to feel like we're peeling back layers of an onion.
Yeah.
And each layer reveals something even more unexpected and complex.
It's a deep dive in the truest sense of the word.
Yeah.
And we've only just scratched the surface.
We've covered a lot of ground already.
We have the
court verdict, the evidence pointing to Maidan snipers, the alleged involvement of far-right groups, and the potential manipulation of forensic evidence.
Right.
It's a lot to take in.
It is.
But it's clear that this alternative narrative deserves a closer look.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's what makes these deep dives so fascinating.
Yeah.
They challenge us to confront uncomfortable truths.
Yeah.
And reconsider everything we thought we knew.
Before we move on, there's one thing that's been bugging me.
Okay.
If this alternative narrative is backed by a court verdict and forensic evidence, why haven't we heard about it before?
Yeah.
What does the article say about how the media handled this story?
That's a crucial point, and it's something we'll explore in more detail in the next part of our deep dive.
All right, sounds good. Let's take a quick break, and we'll be right back.
Yeah, you're right to question why this alternative narrative hasn't gained more traction.
Yeah.
It's a puzzle in itself.
Yeah.
And the article points a finger at the media. Even some reputable outlets and platforms like Wikipedia.
Yeah.
They argue there's been a deliberate effort to downplay or ignore any evidence that contradicts the initial story of a government-led massacre.
That's a pretty serious accusation.
It is.
Are there any specific examples of this kind of media bias?
The article highlights a piece in The Bulwark, a publication considered fairly credible, where the author completely dismissed the idea of Maidan snipers as mere conspiracy theory.
That's concerning, especially considering the court verdict and the forensic evidence we discussed.
Yeah.
It raises doubts about how much of what we've been told about the Maidan massacre is actually based on solid evidence versus a carefully constructed narrative.
It really does.
And it's not just The Bulwark.
Right.
The article criticizes Western media more broadly for presenting a biased and potentially incomplete picture of what happened.
Yeah.
It even calls out Wikipedia for perpetuating a narrative that aligns with the initial claims of a government-led massacre. I use Wikipedia all the time.
I know, right?
It's unsettling to think that such a widely used source of information could be potentially biased on something as significant as this.
It underscores the importance of critical thinking.
Right.
And seeking out multiple perspectives.
Yeah.
We can't simply accept information at face value.
Right.
Especially when it comes from sources that might have a vested interest in shaping public opinion.
If there was this deliberate effort to suppress or distort information about the Maidan massacre, who would benefit from that kind of cover-up?
Well, the article suggests that those who gained power after the overthrow of Yanukovych particularly those with ties to the far-right groups we discussed, had a lot to gain from pushing the narrative of a brutal government crackdown.
So by painting the previous government and the Berkut as the villains, they could solidify their own position and justify their actions.
Exactly. And this manipulation, if that's what it was, had a ripple effect, shaping how the conflict has unfolded ever since.
It's almost like a house of cards built on a shaky foundation.
It is.
If the initial narrative about the Maidan Massacre was distorted, it throws everything that followed into question.
It challenges the whole framework that has been used to explain the conflict in Ukraine, including Western intervention and the demonization of Russia.
That's a lot to process.
It is.
I have to admit, I'm feeling a bit overwhelmed by all this new information. What are we supposed to do with it all?
The most important thing is to stay curious.
Okay.
Don't just dismiss this alternative narrative because it challenges what you might have previously believed. Dig deeper, explore different sources, and form your own conclusions.
You're reminding me of that old saying, question everything.
Exactly.
It seems particularly relevant in this situation.
Absolutely. We have a responsibility to be informed and engaged citizens. That means being critical of the information we're presented with, seeking out different perspectives, and ultimately thinking for ourselves.
This deep dive has definitely shown me the importance of not just accepting the first version of events I hear. It's crucial to look beyond the surface and consider the possibility that there might be more to the story.
That's the spirit of these deep dives. It's about empowering you to think critically and engage with complex issues in a more informed way.
I'm also starting to understand how these events, even if they seem like distant history, are still relevant today.
The Maidan Massacre wasn't just a tragic event. It was a turning point that continues to shape the relationship between Ukraine and Russia.
So understanding the Maidan Massacre, even years later, is crucial for understanding the current conflict.
Precisely. And the article argues that the silence surrounding this alternative narrative is a big part of the problem. It points out that even with the court verdict and all this evidence, there's been a reluctance to truly acknowledge what happened and to grapple with its implications.
Why do you think there's been this silence? Why are people, including journalists and academics, so hesitant to engage with this alternative narrative?
It could be that acknowledging this version of events would be deeply unsettling. It would force us to confront uncomfortable truths about the conflict, the role of Western powers, and the motivations of those who have been presented as heroes.
It's much easier to stick with the simple story, even if it's flawed, than to grapple with the complexities of truth, especially when it comes to something as emotionally charged as war.
That's a very human tendency. But it doesn't help us understand the situation or move towards a resolution. We can't simply sweep inconvenient truths under the rug.
So how do we break through this silence and start having honest conversations about what really happened during the Maidan Massacre?
It starts with individuals like you, the listener. Being willing to engage with these difficult questions. Be willing to challenge conventional wisdom. Seek out multiple perspectives and engage in open and honest dialogue.
Okay, so it's up to each of us to push for a more complete understanding of the truth?
I think so.
Even if it's uncomfortable?
Exactly. We can't rely on others to do the thinking for us. We have to be active participants in the search for truth and understanding.
I appreciate you emphasizing that point. It's easy to get bogged down in all the details and lose sight of the bigger picture.
That's why it's important to take a step back and ask ourselves, what are the implications of this alternative narrative? If it's true, how does it change our understanding of the conflict? And what responsibility do we have to uncover and acknowledge the truth?
Those are some heavy questions.
They are.
This has been a real eye-opener. It's shown me how important it is to be skeptical, to dig deeper, and to never stop questioning.
I'm glad to hear you say that. It's exactly the kind of critical thinking we need to navigate the complexities of the world.
We've covered a lot of ground. The media's role, the potential motives behind the alleged cover-up, and the broader implications of this reinterpretation of the Maidan Massacre. Is there anything else we need to touch on before we wrap things up?
There is, and that's what we'll cover in the next part of our deep dive.
We've been dissecting this alternative narrative of the Maidan Massacre. And it's clear that it challenges a lot of assumptions about the conflict in Ukraine.
Absolutely.
But I'm wondering, where do we go from here?
Right.
How does understanding this event, even if we accept this new interpretation, help us make sense of what's happening now, all these years later?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And the article suggests that the Maidan Massacre wasn't just a catalyst for the conflict, but potentially a microcosm of it.
A microcosm?
Yeah.
I'm not sure I follow.
Think about all the elements we've been discussing. Conflicting narratives, accusations of propaganda, the involvement of far-right groups, questions about Western involvement, the struggle for power and control. These are all themes that permeate the broader conflict in Ukraine today.
So you're saying that the Maidan Massacre, in a way, reflects the larger dynamics of the conflict? It's a smaller scale version of the same forces and motivations that are playing out on a much larger stage.
Exactly. And if that's the case, then understanding the Maidan Massacre becomes even more crucial. It's not just about understanding a single event in the past, but about understanding the underlying patterns and forces that are driving the conflict as a whole.
That's a fascinating insight.
Yeah.
It suggests that by studying the Maidan Massacre, we can gain a deeper understanding of the motivations, the strategies.
I think so.
And maybe even the potential outcomes of the larger conflict.
It's like using a magnifying glass to examine a single thread in a tapestry. By understanding that thread, we can start to see the patterns and complexities of the entire work of art.
That's a great analogy.
Thanks.
So if we apply this idea of the Maidan Massacre as a microcosm to the current situation, what insights can we glean?
For one, it highlights the danger of oversimplification. The conflict in Ukraine is often portrayed as a black and white struggle between good and evil. But the reality is far more nuanced.
We've seen that in our deep dives. It's not as simple as protesters, good government, bad. There are shades of gray competing interests and a lot of fog of war that makes it difficult to determine the truth.
Exactly. And this tendency to oversimplify, to reduce complex issues to easily digestible narratives, can blind us to the underlying causes of conflict and prevent us from finding lasting solutions.
It also makes me think about the role of information and propaganda in shaping our understanding of the conflict.
Absolutely. The Maidan Massacre shows how easily narratives can be manipulated. How information can be suppressed or distorted, and how even seemingly reliable sources can be biased.
So what can we as individuals do to navigate this complex information landscape and form our own informed opinions?
First and foremost, be skeptical. Don't just accept the first version of events you hear, especially when it comes from sources that might have a vested interest in shaping the narrative. Seek out multiple perspectives, cross-reference information, and be willing to question your own assumptions.
It sounds like critical thinking is the key.
It's absolutely essential. We live in a world where information is constantly bombarding us from all directions. And it's more important than ever to develop the skills to sift through that information, identify bias, and determine what's credible.
This deep dive has definitely been a crash course in critical thinking for me.
Good.
It's challenged my assumptions and forced me to look at the conflict in Ukraine from a completely different angle.
That's the power of challenging conventional narratives and exploring different perspectives. It can be uncomfortable, but it's also incredibly rewarding.
Before we wrap things up, is there anything else you want to leave our listener with? Any final thoughts or insights?
The article we've been discussing is just one piece of a much larger puzzle. The Maidan Massacre is a complex event with a lot of unanswered questions. And it's important to keep exploring and learning.
So it's not about arriving at a definitive answer. It's about continuing to ask questions and seek understanding.
Exactly. The more we learn, the more we realize how much we don't know. And that's okay. It's the journey of discovery that truly matters.
This deep dive has definitely been a journey, and it's one that's left me with a lot to think about.
Good. I'm glad.
Thank you for guiding us through this complex and challenging topic.
It's been a pleasure. And remember, the search for truth and understanding never ends. Keep asking questions, keep exploring, and keep an open mind.
I think that's a great note to end on.
Okay.
To our listener, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the Maidan Massacre.
Yes, thank you.
We hope it sparked your curiosity and encouraged you to dig deeper into this complex and consequential event.
Absolutely.
Until next time, keep exploring.